One scientific epoch ended and another began with James Clerk Maxwell, Albert Einstein. Sit down before fact as a little child. Be prepared to give up every preconceived notion. Follow humbly wherever and to whatever abysses nature leads, or you shall learn nothing. Thomas Huxley, Darwin's apostle and tutor to H.G. Wells. We can't have any weak or silly. Life is real again, and the useless and cumbersome and mischievous have to die. They ought to die. They ought to be willing to die. It's a sort of disloyalty, after all, to live and taint the race. The artilleryman in War of the Worlds. Physics did not possess the romantic heroes of the scientific revolution's second phase in quite the same way as chemistry or astronomy did. Instead, sturdier, altogether more temperate figures belonged to its greats. None more so than Sir Isaac Newton. His great achievement had been to describe the laws of motion, such that one could predict with great precision the behaviour of bodies influenced by forces. His Principia Mathematica laid down a framework for explaining the interactions between gravity, mass, and velocity. The truth of these equations is observable through the naked eye and intuitively grasped. What James Clerk Maxwell did was to describe the counterintuitive. He developed a theory of electromagnetism that remains a cornerstone of modern physics to this day. Maxwell was the first to propose that light was a type of electromagnetic wave that lay on a spectrum with radio waves at one end. He also believed that light travelled through a medium known as the ether, but this was not crucial to his physics. Maxwell's proposal of radio waves was later proven to be correct by Heinrich Hertz, whose experiments were given practical application by Marconi, the inventor of modern broadcasting, at the end of the 19th century. Maxwell also worked on a kinetic theory of gases that helped to elucidate the second law of thermodynamics, that in a closed system, entropy always increases and energy tends to dissipate, moving from areas of high concentration to low. In the first half of the 19th century, people were used to thinking about physics in terms of hard principles that could predict with pinpoint accuracy exactly how objects, substances, and particles would behave. Maxwell's innovation was to take a systematic view and deal in probabilities. People imagined a thought experiment in which there were two rooms, one hot, with many excited particles, and the other cold, with fewer, tranquil particles. Between the rooms was a door, and to explain how gases behave thermodynamically, at the time it was imagined that there was an intermediary, bouncer-type figure who let the hot particles travel to cold, but not the other way round. The problem was that in nature, some particles from the cold room would travel towards the hot room. Maxwell reformulated the theory as a statistical probability, in other words, a tendency towards certain movement, rather than a hard rule for every single particle. Again, this predicted the direction of modern physics into the 20th century, and Albert Einstein was particularly inspired by Maxwell's drive to unify areas of physics and to make connections between apparently disparate fields. His theory of relativity synthesized Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian electromagnetism. At the same time, biology as we know it was having its founding moment. Charles Darwin agonized over his theory of evolution for over 17 years after his first drafts were made in 1842. He then only published On the Origin of Species in 1859. It would unleash a whole new political Weltanschauung on the world, to an extent that he could not plausibly have predicted. Simply put, Darwin showed that inherited differences within a given organism will make it more or less likely that the said organism will reproduce itself and pass on these traits. Certain traits are more suited to the creature's habitat and increase the likelihood of organisms with these traits of surviving to maturity and passing them on to the next generation. Over time, the less well-adapted organisms die without having offspring, and the better adapted successfully breed. Through this process, known as natural selection, the species will change its character. In other words, evolve. Darwin did not specifically talk about the origins of mankind in his book, but his carefully considered publication suggests that he was aware of the potential for a public reaction to his work and the conclusions that people would draw from it. And indeed it caused a crisis for many in the religious establishment who saw evolution as a contradiction of scripture and the perfection of man. Before Darwin began publishing, Thomas Malthus said that it was a law of nature that once the population grew to an extent that it could no longer support itself, plague, famine, war or pestilence would break out and reduce numbers back to sustainable levels. He said that it was actually a kindness not to give to the poor, because prolonging their existence drained and diverted necessarily limited resources. Herbert Spencer, who wrote in the wake of Darwin's theories, was one of the first to popularize the idea that governments should not interfere in the struggle for survival, because natural selection also applies to human societies. This mode of thinking held a fascination for the capitalist class, who thought of business in similar terms, where only the fittest prevailed in ruthless competition. Fiction writers were equally inspired by Darwin's theories, particularly H.G. Wells, who imagined a future society where mankind has speciated into two races, the Eloi and Morlocks. Around this time, the middle class challenged the remaining aristocracy as genetically unfit and inbred, and they were concerned that the poor and working class were overbreeding. Many were driven to social activism and inspired to improve the gene pool through what became known as eugenics, or selective breeding, the science of good birth. As Darwin observed that the female of the species tended to select the worthiest mate, many feminists drew inspiration from the theory of sexual selection, and the promotion of contraception was set in the context of controlled reproduction. Of course, there was a dark side to this movement, particularly where it was expressed as racial hygiene, and where it involved the forced sterilization of undesirables, particularly the disabled, in some states of America and in Scandinavia. The culmination of such theories was the cult of the Aryan master race and concentration camps, although, of course, this was far from inevitable.